That's a good example of folk music working backwards. That I mean, you'll hear Mississippi John Hurt play that and everything. And
Yeah.
TJ will have more examples of this. But usually, if you think about the evolution of music, you think, okay, well, finally they put folk music into music notation. But that's a piece that survived, and it was first notated and became, part of the folk tradition orally
Yep.
passed along.
The snake eats its own tail eventually. Um, so that kind of gets us into the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that's when we have all sorts of explosions of popular genres of music. Uh, Pretty much all of them have the banjo, if not front and center, pretty prominent in the mix. And you want to talk about some of these other styles, TJ, that you might know a little
well,
more
it depends.
about?
When do you guys want to do claw hammer? Do you want to do that before or after?
I think
We can go back to
I think
that later.
after.
Let's,
We'll
yeah.
go back to it?
well, I mean, we can right now.
I want to make sure we
It's
have
hard to
time to
determine
hit
that.
some of these other ideas.
Okay, well I've got a fair bit to say about the 1920s as usual.
Yeah.
But if you would like to talk about any four-string stuff before if you want to cover the early four-string.
that's a good
before
call.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Yeah,
we'll
let's
do
do
that. So yeah, four-string banjo gets introduced commercially again somewhere in the early 1900s. I haven't been able to figure out exactly what year, but it's somewhere early 1900s. And yeah, introduced kind of as a way for people who were used to playing mandolin to be able to approach a banjo in this scale length. TJ
We
can
got
talk
rid of
more
the
about
little string.
Yeah, got rid of the drone string, and TJ could talk more about the longer scale length. But yeah, I mean, a lot of single string playing rather than chorded playing with this scale length. A lot of tremolo, just like just that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's what these were for.
I hate you for your tremolo, Ryan. That's so unfair. Ryan's got like one of the most natural tremolos ever.
does
The rest
have-
of us slave.
When you're
over
as
it.
shaky as I
Doesn't
am.
sound good.
He does have good tremolo.
Yeah, it's so
It's just
annoying.
because he's really nervous.
Yeah.
All the time.
He just hasn't had a cigarette in a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, eventually this would be used with Irish music too. But what is regarded as Irish tuning today dates more to the 50s and 60s rather than what was originally used with Irish music. Because Barney from the Dubliners started tuning his banjo to an octave below a mandolin so that he could follow a fiddle even easier. But yeah, I'll do you part of one of theirs, but I don't have it in his too. $1841, I put my corduroy breeches on. I put my corduroy breeches on to go working on the railway, the railway. I grow weary of the railway, for Patty works on the railway. I was wearing corduroy breeches, digging ditches, throwing switches, dodging hitches. I was working on the railway.
Yeah.
That's kind of Irish stuff there.
Let's say that's an Irish American song, then I imagine.
Yeah, well, I mean, the melodies go back apparently to both.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of things that have a very similar melody.
Right.
But yeah, came around day of the railroad.
Excellent.
When banjos are also coincidentally getting around a whole lot more than they used to.
That's true. Banjos and railroad trains, there's no small Venn
Oh.
diagram crossover of people
That-
who are into both of those things.
That is a perfect banjo reference. The dinging bell of a train crossing gate is known as the banjo signal because
didn't know
it
this.
looks like this going back and forth.
Oh, yeah.
It's not a signal for the local wives to toss their husband's banjos onto the tracks.
Well, it's that time again.
Unfortunately, most of those banjos don't make it onto the rails.
Yeah, it's more of a banjo alert.
Well,
Run.
banjo's like a grenade. Once you heard it, it's too late.
Oh, yes. I guess we could just tell banjo jokes for another 20 minutes and call it a day, but maybe we'll do that at the end. You want to talk
Yeah,
about some
Yeah,
of the stuff that
absolutely.
you know so much about?
Ryan sort of mentioned how we start to see four-string banjos in America and worldwide. You start to see ragtime appear as a popular genre in the late 1800s and throughout the 19 teens. And there's even rags being composed in the 1920s. Throughout the 19 teens, you're still seeing lots of five-string banjo being used in ragtime, fingerstyle rag performers such as Wes Osman and Fred Van Epps were very prominent in the ragtime world. Their recordings are remarkable. Now this is still in the age of acoustic recording, so they must have been, you have these great big recording horns rather than microphones, and the banjo players would be playing right up against the horn with a whole orchestra behind them. So it's deceiving because it makes it sound like the banjo is actually equally as loud as a 20-piece orchestra, but in fact it's all about the placement of the banjo, I think, against the horn.
Yeah.
Not to say that these weren't very commanding banjo players. But then as jazz starts to become a popular form of American music and ragtime evolves into jazz music, you start to see a switch from guitars being used in small ensembles to banjos, largely because you are finding that the string instruments had to compete more and more with a louder, brasher, more wild sound. In early New Orleans music, guitar was the popular accompanying chord instrument along with the piano, but that did change to the banjo in the late 19 teens. I have a plectrum banjo here. The plectrum banjo is more directly related to the five-string banjo than the tenor banjo. It's the same scale length.
Yep.
I've got the same amount of frets, I think.
And here's another interesting connection. The tuning that is used on these plectrum banjos comes from the tuning on the minstrel banjo. The minstrel banjo has that really low tuning. When in the 1880s, they raised it up a fourth, and this is the same tuning, just dropping the fifth. So that's an important connection because the tuning of the banjo is very relevant in the style that it's used.
Thank you. Yeah. So we call this a plectrum banjo. A plectrum. A plectrum is the old-timey or the European term for a pick, a guitar pick. So it's really showing the difference now, but we've moved into this strumming technique. Some people believe that tenor banjos were more popular in orchestras and jazz ensembles because they had a bigger, brighter sound, and perhaps plectrums were more popular in small group stuff because of their deeper tonal qualities. I don't believe this myself. I've done a lot of looking into what the different orchestras were using, and seen lots of video evidence from the 1920s, film evidence, and I see both quite a lot. I do the tenor banjo has a very bright sound, but the plectrum banjo too can also be played in a very bright way. Too bright, you might say. No. So in the 1920s, you're seeing plectrum banjos and tenor banjos, and I think used in almost equal measure. When the Dixieland era comes in, that's traditional jazz revival, I get the impression tenor banjos were a little more popular than the plectrums. However, in the banjo band world, in the banjo club world, which, believe it or not, was separate to the traditional jazz revival of the 1940s, you see a lot of plectrum banjos. I'll talk a bit about why that is in a second. But moving on to talking about the plectrum style of playing, the pick style of playing, Ryan Koenig demonstrated a little bit of that single string method where you're using a tremolo. The tremolo is just where you move the pick up and down as quickly as you can to try and get the sustain, because that's the most sustain I can get without it. Whereas with it, I can I can play a melody, and I can sweep over the sound of the orchestra and really be heard. You know, you can hear me nice and clearly, and that's a single string method. And single string playing was what you hear a lot in the 19-teens and mid-1920s. Throughout the 1920s, certain banjo players developed a technique they called the chord melody style of playing. Let me try and pick a tune here. There's a tune, Chinatown, My Chinatown. If I was playing it single string, that'd be single string. I could put a tremolo in if I wanted to. Certain banjo players found that if they wanted to really sustain the rhythm of the group and also provide a fuller sound, perhaps, they could do this method called chord melody. This is where you have your chord. So the chords for the same part of the tune I just played would be this. One chord to a 5 chord, back to a 1 for any musicians in the audience. And then what these banjo players did is they added the chord in behind the melody. Every note of the melody has a chord behind it. There's my tremolo again. And you can see how that's a really full sound. I almost don't need the whole group behind me. You can create a very
Good, 'cause
full.
they don't want to play with
Yeah, you know what I'm playing like that. Yeah.
And you only have to pay one banjo player for 2 banjo parts.
Yeah. And so the chord melody became quite a popular technique, and listen out for it in 1920s records. You'll probably start to notice that you hear the banjo players either playing single string. Or you'll hear them doing this other style. You'll hear them doing all that sort of wild syncopated stuff with chords. And lots of players will do a variation of the two. But I just wanted to give you something that you could listen out for when you listen to these old jazz records, that you could listen out for the banjos doing.
Do you have that example of the tremolo and the chord behind it? Or am
Yeah,
throwing you
I was
under
going
the
to get to
bus?
that.
Okay,
Yeah.
Sorry.
So this is talking about just talking about the ensembles. Just to give you a bit of background, in town here in St. Louis, I lead a group called the Arcadia Dance Orchestra. It's a authentic 11-piece 1920s style orchestra where we use all the original sheet music from the 1920s, and we do a lot of St. Louis material from the 20s as well. Through doing that group, I've really learned. I don't play banjo in that group. I play trumpet, but I'm always bullying my banjo player about playing louder, getting heavier strings, because it's all about projection, and that really influenced the way people played back then. You had to have big, heavy strings. You had to project. You had to have a big sound, like Ryan demonstrated, because you had to be heard over 10 other players, all with louder instruments than you, technically, if you didn't push. So that's as much as I'm going to go into in terms of ensemble playing. If there's any questions about 1920s jazz banjo, but anything any more in depth anyone would like to know, feel free to ask at the end. I think we'll have time for questions at the end. Nick asked me to talk real quick about the vaudevillians. Of course, banjo was really popular, as much as it was popular in the pop and the jazz music of the 1920s. It was incredibly popular in the vaudeville circuit, and lots of the stars of the vaudeville circuit were still around in the 1950s and 60s. You might remember Eddie Peabody. Anyone here know the name Eddie Peabody? He was a vaudevillian of the 1920s who was still performing on shows like the Lawrence Welk Show well into the 1960s. And he had this, he was just delightful. He was one of the guys who really pushed the chord melody style forwards. He would take a tune, let me think, like The World is Waiting on the Sunrise. You'll go. And he would like bounce his leg like that whilst he played. He would flip his banjo. He would do this one Eddie Peabody thing I often steal is that when he would get to the end of a song, He did lots of what I call the whip bongs, where you go whip bong like that. You'll get it to a break. You do that, and so that's one vaudevillian trick I picked up. If I'm playing, I'll go back to Chinatown. If I'm doing Chinatown, this is a trick for any musicians in the audience. My lowest string is a C. I know that's my open string, and that's the key of a song, which means that I can do a stupid trick at the end of a song with it. I can go, let's see. I can do that. I can just flip my banjo out like that, and thank you. And that's an old Eddie Peabody technique. I'm going to wrap it up real quick here. Another vaudevillian was Perry Brechtill. And he had a trick he called the two banjo trick, which Eddie Peabody also worked on. I'm not as good at it as I used to be, but I would like to tell you about it very briefly. He would have a shtick where he would say, well, the Vega Banjo Company are employing me and my band to be here. There were supposed to be 3 of us, but, well, Bob got the flu, and Jim, well, his wife wouldn't let him out the house. Now, Vega will only pay us if all 3 of us play. So I guess I'll have to do all 3 parts. And that's how he'd set up the routine. And first of all, he would say, well, there's the melody. And there's the bass line. And there's the chords. And then he'll do all 3 at once. Now, I haven't practiced this in a long time, but I think I can show you the gist of it. You'll have to go online for a better demonstration. But
That's awesome.
yeah.
Another important vaudeville thing that I want to make a note of that I kind of just thought of right now. That's where the 4-string banjo and really the banjo becomes associated with popular country music, because bands like Otto Gray's Oklahoma Cowboys, which were the first filmed country band, and they were popular in the vaudeville circuit doing kind of cowboy country and shooting tricks and roping tricks. But yeah, they had a 4-string banjo player.
Do you have any shooting tricks tonight?
No.
Lasso?
No.
Well, it should be said, too, that vaudeville grew right out of the minstrel scene. And I did mention earlier that the minstrel show would have the vaudeville show would have. It had music, comedians, and usually a big combination, a lot of people who did both, and just various talent. And it would often incorporate musicians doing little tricks and stuff, like TJ was showing you there. And that lasted into the vaudeville era. And funny enough, I saw a lot of that on Hee Haw.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of country stuff, and Hee Haw, if you think about it, is kind of a modern day country vaudeville or minstrel format to the show. Music, comedy, variety. Yeah, exactly.
The other thing I wanted to say about the just 20s banjo in jazz is, especially with the guitar being the popular instrument in New Orleans bands, I mean, that's really the perfect segue. That's also when the 6-string banjo really comes to prominence. Yeah, which is pretty much just a guitar tuning on a banjo, used by Johnny St. Cyr and a couple other people to play jazz on, because you can go playing way up the neck and have a brighter tone, but was also used by blues players because you can finger pick and get the low end too.
Yeah.
Papa Charlie Jackson, he was the big
Yeah.
guy, wasn't
Yeah.
he, for 6-string blues banjo.
Yep. Django Reinhardt, that was his first
He started on 6
instrument, but we're talking about early American music.
Yeah.
Did you still want to play a full version of Chinatown, or should we just?
I'm a bit
we're
worried.
running a little low on time.
Yeah,
we might
yeah.
want to play.
Maybe if we get to the end, I can do some.
Yeah.
more.
So maybe we'll throw us all together and get a whole bunch of banjos going at once.
Yeah.
Sure.
Does that
Or
sound
did
good?
Ryan, did you have one on there you wanted to demonstrate?
Oh yeah, I guess I could do the
Yeah,
blues
yeah.
real
Yeah,
quick. Yeah.
We are at the
Actually,
Blues
let's talk
Museum.
about this. Let's have a thing real quick when I
Yeah.
Because otherwise somebody will ask me
Okay,
about it.
yeah.
We
Well,
can
let's
talk about it
be
together.
quick.
Hallelujah, hallelujah, I belong to the band, hallelujah, 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 I belong to the band, hallelujah. What kind of band are you talking about? It was that Holy Union band, I belong to the band, hallelujah, oh hallelujah, hallelujah, I belong to the band, hallelujah.
Yeah.
You said you had something you want to
Oh
throw?
yeah, I'm not going to talk about this very much, but this is a curious instrument from the late 1920s. Recorded microphones meant that the guitars could come back into the popular music once again. They could be heard with new technology. So there was a lot of banjo players out there that needed to be convinced to buy new guitars. So the National Guitar Company created these 4-string resonator guitars with banjo necks, almost as an advertising tool to try and convince all of the dance orchestra and dance band banjo players to invest real money in new 6-string guitars. But they could be used very effectively as a swing instrument. And so on. So there you go.
Yeah.
So this is a plectrum national guitar.
This is also relevant in the decay of the banjo in popular music because these were designed by the Dopura brothers, which is where you get the name dobro. There was a medicine show, a guy that ran a medicine show that came to these two brothers to invent a louder guitar because the African American performers in his band or in his show were getting tired of all the connotations associated with the banjo. So it shows the decay of the banjo in popular music and the evolution of this, which we think of typically in blues music. But if you want to learn more about this, next Sunday, not this upcoming Sunday, I'll be at the Science Center from noon to 4 talking just about national guitars. So we won't do that now. But
Nice.
okay, that'd be great.
I think in the remaining time we'll try to play some of these songs that we talked about playing all together.
Okay.
Because this isn't going to be an exact representation of the banjo club kind of craze, but there were a lot of folks who would get together and just play all banjo style instruments.
What do you want to
And,
do?
Let's see. We had a few we wanted to try. Jackson Stomp, maybe.
Oh,
be a
yeah.
good place to
Let's do
start.
that.
I'll usually get you on that.
B flat.
And speaking of weird banjo things, this is just a banjo with a mandolin neck on it, which is pretty much made to get mandolin players playing banjos.
Who have we not gotten? The mandolinists.
There's more of them.
All right, B flat.
Capo?
Okay, we're gonna play a tune called Jackson Stomp. It's actually a piano piece that string players stole and renamed, but it was initially called the Cow Cow Blues. Yeah,
Ryan's got to grab something.
at a B flat. Are you sure? Yeah. We'll wait for you. You guys want to do a short one after the 4? Got that?
Short one after what?
The 4.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. All right.
The 11 bar.
The 11 bar. AABB. AABB, boys. 2, 3, 4. wives love it when we practice.
More banjo.
More banjo.
What else did we talk about? Oh, we talked about so one type of music that was played a lot in early minstrel music, and even before the kind of coalescing of something that could be called minstrel music, was a lot of Scotch-Irish tunes that came over and immediately got mangled up and blended into American melting pot kind of style. We were playing that Liberty when we got together, which is a square dance tune, basically. But we were doing it with a bunch of banjos, so let's do that again. That'd be fun. We'll do that for you. We'll squeeze in. I told you in the beginning we were going to do more musicking than talking, but
See where that got us.
yeah. Turns out the only thing that gets any of us talking is nerdy things, nerdy banjo talk. Then you can't shut us up. We'll try to squeeze in a couple more if they'll let us. Who's kicking that?
Indeed.
Out of D?
Yeah.
Okay.
All good?
Yeah, buddy.
1, 2, 3, 4.
You really cooked it on that one, Ryan.
What else did we have on?
Germany.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So since we're at the National Blues Museum, we could maybe wrap it up with that, since I think we need to wrap the stuff up. But there's a lot we didn't get to talk about, but we'll just play you one more.
Yeah.
This
What
is
were you playing on this?
I'm going to do "Going to Germany." I'm going to play the 5-string on this. What do you want? You want to get Jeff?
Do this guy.
And this is one that was recorded, I think written by Gus Cannon, who had a jug band who recorded out of Memphis in the late 20s and early to mid 30s.
Do we want to still do questions after this one, or
If
wanna leave the
they're not
mystery?
kicking us out of here, we can do some questions and answers. Is that what you're
are
asking?
you guys closing up? Yeah.
But we'll do a little kind of country bluesy number.
What's your key?
G.
G for banjo.
I was way down there. I'm going to Germany. I'll be back some old day. I'm going to Germany. I'll be back some old day. I'm going to Germany. I'll be back some old day. Please tell me, Mama, what more can I do? Please tell me, Mama, what more can I do? All I know is I can't get along with you. Thank you all. Thanks to the National Blues Museum, and thanks for y'all for coming out. That was fun. And if unless they need to clear us off the stage, well, if
We
anybody
can
does
do.
have any,
We have time for
questions?
2 questions from
Oh,
the
cool.
audience.
Let's
If
do that.
anybody would like to ask a question, raise your hand. I can bring the microphone over.
Ha!
No questions?
We've done our job well.
Okay, here we go.
I've always thought more of guitars with blues music than banjo. So are you saying that the guitar evolved from the banjo, or was it 2 separate instruments that culture made the guitar?
yeah, they're definitely
more
two
popular.
separate instruments, but they did converge in the States, among other places. And most of the early blues players, because blues was developed in the same timeline that we're talking about minstrel music in the same circumstances. And so a lot of those players were doing like the call and response kind of stuff that Nick was talking about on banjos and available instruments. And guitars became, again, when they started being mass produced and sold in catalogs in the late 1800s, all of a sudden you could get a cheap guitar even on a small income. And so at that point, that's when the guitar kind of started pushing out banjo as the preferred instrument for a lot of folks who were playing blues music.
And another distinction I think may be important to make is to perhaps think about the blues separate from instruments, because the blues exists without, you can play it on whatever instrument. And it became popularized on the guitar, through various forms. One that happened recently was Eric Clapton did a record on Robert Johnson. And if you talk to us, Robert Johnson is like way new, but
It's
he
like
was
the Justin Bieber.
exactly.
No,
He's
no,
the
no,
Justin.
no, no, no.
But anyways, and it,
Not at all.
if there was one thing
Or-
that I
or a
think would be
fringe case,
important to get away from this talk would be that all the musics that we talked about, while inspired by the instrument, once they've been created, are now separate from the instruments. So the blues is the blues without a guitar or without a banjo. It's it's just kind of its own.
And
It's an emotion.
yeah, I'm really glad you said that, and especially here in St. Louis. I think if you went back to the 1920s in St. Louis and talked about blues, the musicians people would mention wouldn't be the lone guitar player image. People would be talking about piano players, really. But St. Louis is a big piano blues town, and people probably associated back more closely with the blues than anything to do with this the singer-songwriter sort of blues thing. But also horn players. Charles Kreff was a St. Louis horn player, and he was considered nationally to be one of the greatest blues musicians, not just blues trumpet players, nationally one of the greatest blues musicians. So yeah, there are banjo players out there as well who are considered great blues banjo players. So I think you said it best, Nick. But I just wanted to name drop some St. Louis people.
I think that's wise. Thank you for the question, though. That's a
Yeah.
great question.
Does anybody else have a question they would like to ask?
We'll make up an answer.
Okay, here we go. This will be our final question.
Are these instruments all tuned the same, and are any of them tuned in fifths like a violin?
Yeah.
Yes. So to the first question, no. To the second question, yes.
Mandolin is the exact same as a violin, except with courses of strings, so 2 strings at once.
Yeah, so this is like a mandolin banjo, a mando banjo. Yeah, so that's tuned. Well, exactly is the wrong adjective, but yeah, just like a fiddle.
Yeah,
A
I mean
violin.
it's still EADG from high to low.
And also the tenor banjo that Ryan played earlier is also tuned in fifths.
Yeah.
Otherwise, this is tuned like a guitar, so
Exactly
a
like
lot
a
of
guitar.
fourths and a third. This is an open tuning.
Which means that it's tuned
Open
to a chord.
G, which is what a lot of blues guitar players would use.
Then this tuning here is a lot like the open. These strings are the same, but I got a C. My low strings are C. We call it C standard. Plectrum tuning.
If you really get into it, that's standard tuning on the banjo, on the 5-string banjo, and then what is now considered standard tuning is raised bass tuning. But
This
what you're
this
in now.
open G now is considered standard, but this is the older tuning, and this
And
is the
this
same
is
on
tuned
both
just
of
the
those.
same as that, but a good bit lower, but
Yeah.
same shape. So there's the long answer.
Right.
Thank
Yeah,
you all.
thanks.
Thank you.
All right. So once again, a very special thank you to Ryan Koenig, Ryan Spearman, TJ Miller, and Nick Pence. I hope you enjoyed this program. Yeah, let's hear it for them. I really hope you enjoyed this program. I hope you were entertained. I hope you learned something. Programs like this are made possible by people just like you, our members, our donors, our visitors. So if you haven't considered it, we strongly urge you to consider becoming a member of the National Blues Museum. As a member, you'll get exclusive access to members-only events. You get discounts in the museum gift shop. You get discounts on concert tickets, as well as free admission to the museum. And you also play a role in supporting programming just like this that we are continuing to offer free because of that support. So other than that, I do want to say thank you once again for joining us tonight. Thank you for everyone that's viewing through Live Living Network and everyone that watched on Facebook. But other than that, I hope you all have a great evening, and thanks again for joining us.